Thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. And on behalf of my co-convener, Tsiona Lida, where are you, Tsiona? There you are. Hello. I'd like to welcome you all to the first in-person Modern Jewish History seminar that we're running this fall. We will have, I think, we're doing an event next week as well, aren't we? In person, but upstairs in the small seminar room, and we'll have a couple of more in-person events this term. So it's nice to be back, and it's especially nice to be welcoming Benjamin Balint to Harvard to speak about, or from his new book, Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. Let me just introduce Ben briefly. So he is a writer of nonfiction who's written a number of extremely well-received books. His previous book was called Kafka's Last Trial, and that was a wonderful study of the posthumous fate of Kafka's manuscripts, and it won the 2020 Samuel Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. He also is the co-author of a beautiful book called Jerusalem, City of the Book, which is about the libraries of Jerusalem, and it's with gorgeous photographs. And also then his first book was called Running Commentary. So that's a cute pun because it was about the American Journal of Opinion, by that name, and its longstanding associations with major trends in modern Jewish political and social thought. Ben has taught literature at the Al-Quds Bard College of the Arts and Sciences in East Jerusalem. He's written reviews and journalism in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, Die Zeit, magazines such as the Weekly Standard. He's translated poetry from Hebrew, or as the New Yorker always says, from the Hebrew, which I love. It's like cooperate with the little, they're sticklers for style. So he's translated from the Hebrew in The New Yorker, Poetry International, and Crazy Horse. So Ben, it's a delight to welcome you to Harvard. Very much look forward to the talk.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Derek, for the introduction. I'd like to begin with a painted ceiling of a 17th century Polish wooden synagogue that I saw at the Polin Museum in Warsaw, in which Hebrew text from the Kabbalistic mystical tradition sort of divides the ceiling into these gorgeous images of nature and fantasy. And this, I realize, as I'm standing there, is the culture that produced one of the great Polish modernist writers and artists, Bruno Schulz, who produced intensely impassioned lyrical writing that elaborates on his own personal mythology, and we'll talk about mythology and the meaning of myth in Bruno Schulz. But he also produced deeply unrabbinical visual art that is full of pathos and comedy and eros and magic. During the Second World War, Bruno Schulz, this is him in Drohobych, survived longer than he might have because an Austrian SS officer named Felix Landau essentially used him and forced him to paint. He was sort of his house painter. And in 1942, another Gestapo officer who had argued with Schulz's protector, Landau, shot Schulz in the street. And at the time of his death, Schulz was working on a novel that's never been found called The Messiah. That synagogue ceiling that I was standing under is painted with a vision of the Messianic age, in which savagery turns into extravagant friendliness and hope. So for example, a bear offers you a pineapple. A lion holds forth a bunch of flowers, and it's full of images of extravagant hopefulness. And that hopefulness relates to Schulz's mythology of the Messiah. Now, I want to elaborate on that. The expert in the artifice of myth-making became a myth himself, and that myth centered on two absences. One is the lost manuscript of the Messiah, and the second is many of his paintings that were lost and dispersed, including the final murals that he was forced to paint. The last thing he was coerced to paint were the murals for the children's room of this SS officer. I want to begin at the end. Before delving with you into the life and mythology of Bruno Schulz, I want to begin not in 1942, but in 2001. this is the reason I'm beginning at the end is because the end of the story is in Jerusalem, where I've just come from. And Jerusalem regards itself not just as a place for the ingathering of exiles, but also for the place as a place of the ingathering of material culture. That was the case, Derek mentioned the case of Kafka's manuscripts, which after a long legal battle at the Israeli Supreme Court ended up in Jerusalem. And that's the case with these murals that we're seeing here of Bruno Schulz. In 2001, a pair of German documentary filmmakers, Benjamin and Christian Geisler, after a great deal of research, came to Drohobych, Bruno Schulz's hometown, in search of these lost artworks, these fairy tale scenes that he was forced to paint. They were lost for decades behind the Iron Curtain in a three-story building that Felix Landau had appropriated for himself. When that part of Galicia became absorbed into Soviet Ukraine, that building was divided into 5 apartments given to Ukrainian apparatchiks, and these murals were painted over and considered lost. The Geisler's motivation for going in search of them was guilt. Christian Geisler's father had been a convinced Nazi, and in locating this last vision of Schulz's suffering, their hope was somehow, I think, to atone for the family's sins. In other words, the Geislers, and I interviewed the son Benjamin, we're not drawn so much by curiosity as by penance. So they go to the kitchen pantry of this old elderly Ukrainian couple who had no idea what was in their apartment. They took down the shelves of herring and pickles and the bunches of garlics, and they were able, through a certain technique, to take out the outer layers of paint. And this is the first glimpse of what they found, the day that they found it in February of 2001. This proud blue-helmeted driver is actually, as we'll see in a moment, holding the reins of a carriage. And this is Bruno Schulz's last self-portrait. And maybe, too, it's a sort of, I read it as a kind of resistance of the effacement of his own individuality. Now, the Geislers made a kind of mistake. Immediately after making this discovery, they informed the various appropriate authorities, both in the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine and in Poland. Bruno Schulz was, of course, Polish and wrote in Polish. And last but not least, Avner Shalev, then head of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Bruno Schulz once wrote that the knot of the soul, that the soul got itself tied up into, is not a false knot that comes undone when you pull the threads. On the contrary, when you pull the threads, it draws tighter. We handle it, he said, we trace the paths of separate threads, and we look for the end of the string, and out of these manipulations comes art. I want to consider the competing claims on Bruno Schulz, so long after his death, as the ends of separate strings that trace their origins back into Schulz's life. Essentially what happened is, 3 months after this scene that we see here, a team consisting of Yad Vashem and Mossad agents shows up in Drohobych, and through various briberies that I was able to uncover, managed to get permission from this Ukrainian couple to chisel out 5 fragments of the last artworks of Bruno Schulz. This is one of the fragments. Here you see the charioteer, Bruno Schulz's face, holding the reins. The other scenes are, Hansel and Gretel scenes, very fairy tale scenes, in short. And with the help of then Israeli ambassador to Poland, Shevach Weiss, they spirited them across the Ukrainian-Polish border and flew them back to Israel. This is why I say Jerusalem saw itself as the end of a diaspora story, the culmination of a story that had really had nothing to do with Israel until this point. And of course, all hell breaks loose because they broke all kinds of international laws and conventions. And there were 8 years of negotiations, mostly with the Ukrainians. Finally, they were able, and meanwhile, these are not publicly viewable. And finally, 8 years later, they signed an agreement with the Ukrainians, and the first visitor to Yad Vashem after the signing happens to be then Secretary of State Clinton. This is a photograph of her marveling at some of the fragments of Bruno Schulz's murals. Now I want to go back and think about with you why. Why did Israel do this, but also why was Schultz pulled various ways by these strings of history? So now a word about Schultz's life. Schultz was, as he often said, born an Austrian, lived as a Pole, and died as a Jew. His life began under the Austro-Hungarian double eagle, and without moving, he became a subject of the West Ukrainian People's Republic, the Second Polish Republic until 1939, briefly the USSR 1939 to 1940, and then the Third Reich. He almost never left Drohobych. He made some exceptions. Sometimes he went to Warsaw. He spent part of World War I in Vienna, but he spent his whole life very close to where he was born in Drohobych. Drohobych, of course, was part of Galicia, and that was Galicia at the time was the largest and also most densely populated part of the Austrian Empire. The Viennese liked to condescend to this borderland by calling it half Asian, as if it was sort of halfway between the Occident and the Orient. And in my family, for example, to say someone was a typical Galicianer was to lob an insult. But actually, in my opinion, to call Galicia a borderland is to adopt the gaze from the center. For Bruno Schultz, the borderland was the center. In the opening of one of his short stories called The Republic of Dreams, Bruno Schultz called his home region this singular province, a city unique in all the world. This city and this region locked themselves into a self-sufficient microcosm, installed themselves at their own risk on the very brink of eternity. And just as his home province of Galicia was a place of the blurring of fluctuating borders, at the heart of Schultz's art is also a blurring of borders between animal and human, so metamorphosis, just like Franz Kafka is very much part of his fiction, between animate and inanimate, between instinct and intellect, and then, to use his phrase, between the darkness of myth and the sharp contours of actual history. Drohobych itself was often described rather unmathematically as 1.5 cities. It was half Polish, half Jewish, half Ukrainian. That's the way it felt. Its streets resounded with a mix of Polish, Yiddish, Ukrainian, German, and during Schultz's childhood, more than 40% of Drohobych was Jewish. He himself went once or twice a year to the largest synagogue in Drohobych. It's called the Choral Synagogue, which took 23 years to build. It still stands, although it was used when it was part of Ukraine as a furniture warehouse. I interviewed someone who remembers that they used to buy their couches there, and that where the Torah scrolls, the niche of the Torah scrolls had been, they had simply removed the wall, and that's where the trucks backed up. It's since, in 2018, been restored. It's a glorious place. Of course, there are very few Jews left there, but it's a glorious place. It's also where, by the way, Menachem Begin and his wife Aliza got married. This is Schultz as a young man in Drohobych. Despite his lack of formal training, in 1924, he began to teach arts and crafts, draftsmanship, woodworking at the very same high school that he himself had graduated from. He was a very odd teacher. He, as much as Kafka loathed his day job at the insurance agency, Bruno Schultz loathed his job teaching high schoolers. At the same time, he held his students spellbound when he departed from woodworking and arts and crafts and began to extemporaneously spin stories. Here's one of his students, Zev Fleischer, describing the experience of studying with Schultz. He was one of those people who kind of apologized for their very existence. So you can only imagine what went on during his lessons. I think he realized very fast that he could save himself only if he did something different. So he had this brilliant idea. He would tell us extemporaneous stories, and it was like painting with words. He told stories, and we listened. Even the wilde chayes listened, so to speak, wild animals, the most misbehaved children. And he did nothing else. The wildest kids sat there enchanted. We could even smell the things that he described. I remember how, for example, he described the smell of cinnamon, which was dominant in the commercial area of Drohobych. And of course, one of his famous books, Bruno Schultz's famous books, is called The Cinnamon Shops. Now, at the same time as he's teaching in the 1920s, he is also attaining some renown as an artist. I think of him almost as the Galician equivalent of William Blake. He attained a kind of brilliant imaginative expression in both verbal and visual arts. I mentioned before that there are a lot of disappearances in the story of Bruno Schulz. One of them has to do with his paintings. This is the only painting of his that survived the Second World War. It's called Encounter. When I see this, it reminds me of a famous passage in Freud where he describes both of Freud's parents, by the way, were from Galicia, where Freud says that he was walking with his father and he felt shame because his father had to kind of be deferential to non-Jewish passers-by. That's what I think of when I see this. This Bruno Schulz gave the title Encounter. At the same time, in the 1920s, he's publishing a book of these etchings called The Book of Idolatry, with very masochistic themes. He was trying to translate his visual art into words to the point of impossibility, one of his students said. Now, to realize something about the context of this masochistic art, we can realize that there was something going on in this part of Poland that had to do with the decay and fermentation of the empire. And this is why we have Bruno Schulz writing in Polish and very in astonishing geographic proximity. You have Josef Roth writing in German, Shai Agnon writing in Hebrew, and you have Leopold von Sacher-Masoch giving his name to masochism. This is all happening in this part of Galicia. So Schulz has a couple of themes in his etchings. Some of them are, men at the feet of women in the Book of Idolatry, but others are very messianic scenes of Jews gathered around a well awaiting the Messiah, people around a Passover Seder. So it's a very odd mixture of things. But I want to keep, the reason I mentioned this masochistic element of the art is because about 20 years after this, he met a real sadist, right? This was all in his imaginings. So he gains renown. I interviewed a son of survivors from Drohobych who said, in our family, we didn't even need to say the name Bruno Schulz. We just said the pornographer, and everyone understood to whom we were referring. Now to his writings. This is his fiancée. Like Franz Kafka, he had a very troubled relationship. He was engaged, broken engagement. This was his fiancée, Josefina Jelinska. Together, they were the first translators of Kafka into Polish. I've been told in Poland that to this day, the translations that they made in the 1930s of Franz Kafka are considered the gold standard, the very voice of Kafka in Polish. At a certain point, his literary creativity expresses itself, above all, in letters to women. Just like the letters of Franz Kafka to Milena Jesenska, he's writing to his fiancée, but he's also writing to a Yiddish modernist poet named Dvorah Fogel. And he's appending postscripts that are imaginative depictions of like a childlike wonder wandering through what a child would see wandering through the streets of Drohobych. Over time, his letters to Fogel get shorter and shorter, and the postscripts get longer and longer, more fantastical and more unmoored from mundane reality. And one day, Fogel says, both to Bruno Schulz and to her friend Rachel Auerbach, you got to publish these. This is important literary work. And so he goes to Warsaw, meets with an editor at the most prestigious publishing house there, and he publishes two books, one in 1934, one in 1937. And the books are interlocked stories that interweave three main characters. There's a sort of sensitive boy named Joseph, named after the biblical dreamer, who narrates the stories and in effect is narrating the story of his own life and his own life as an artist. The second protagonist is the father, who, much like Bruno Schulz's father, is ailing, is quite weak, but also he's this sort of eccentric cloth merchant who delivers soliloquies on mystical themes, on the second book of Genesis, on mannequins coming to life. And he wavers all the time between sort of mercantilism and mysticism. Many of his disquisitions on mysticism, the father's that is, are interrupted by a seductive housemaid named Adela. She shows up in almost all of Bruno Schulz's stories, who delights in ridiculing the father's flights of fancy. To borrow Schulz's own phrase, let's go to the back a little bit. He's also drawing on the Kabbalistic tradition. He's drawing on the Messianic tradition, although he himself is not an observant Jew in any sort of the way. And as you see here, he both in his visual and his fiction, he's depicting a search for a mythical book. Sometimes he calls it the Book of Splendor, which literally translated would be the Zohar, which, if correctly interpreted, would explain existence, would unravel the riddles of life. This book is not the Bible. As a matter of fact, the father figure gives Joseph a Bible, and Joseph says this is a counterfeit. It's something authentic that cannot be found, but when it is found, when we have glimpses of it, Joseph gets glimpses of it in what otherwise we would consider trash. For example, a phone book with advertisements, trashy advertisements in the back and classifieds. This for him has something of the sacred about it. Or it could be a stamp album. So that blasphemy, in a way, very colorful blasphemy, made Bruno Schulz kind of a venerated spirit for a whole procession of writers after he died, including Philip Roth. Philip Roth is the one who sort of made Bruno Schulz famous in this country with his series, you may remember, The Writers from the Other Europe. And this is already in the 70s, alongside Milan Kundera and Danilo Kish, etc. Including Cynthia Ozick, whose Messiah of Stockholm is a novel woven around the supposed reappearance of the lost manuscript. Including David Grossman, who puts Bruno Schulz, the myth of Bruno Schulz, at the very center of his masterpiece, Sea Under Love. Including Olga Tokarczuk, who I saw in Jerusalem, who told me over breakfast that she both hates and loves Bruno Schulz, loves him because of the mastery of the language, and hates him because of the mastery of the language that's so difficult to overcome. His influence is so difficult to overcome. And last, I'll mention Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was writing, of course, in Yiddish, not in Polish, who tells Philip Roth in 1985, my family had been in Poland for 8 generations, and my father spoke 2 words of Polish. I was not reading Bruno Schulz until I came to this country. And when I did, he said, Schulz struck me as someone who wrote sometimes like Proust, sometimes like Kafka, but reached depths that neither of those reached. If Schulz had been allowed to live out his life, Singer said, he might have given us untold treasures. But what he did in his short life was enough to make him one of the most remarkable writers who ever lived. Now we can understand why these very sadomasochistic scenes caught the eye in 1942 of this SS officer, Felix Landau, who became sort of the guardian devil of Bruno Schulz. And this raises, of course, an obvious question, which is, how do we relate to these murals created under conditions of coercion? Do we say that can we compare them in any way to those works of Bruno Schulz that were created under conditions of freedom? In other words, is there an irony in the fact that of all the works of Bruno Schulz, most of the surviving works are now in Poland, the only work that is in Jerusalem is precisely that work that was created, so to speak, at gunpoint, right? So these are some of the sort of cultural conundrums that the case of Bruno Schulz raised, raised to me. And I'll just say that when I went to Drohobych in 2020, there's every 2 years a Schulzfest there. Schulzfest means all the Schulzoids, as they call themselves, gather from all over the world in Drohobych, often on the anniversary of his death in November 19th. And I met, for example, his Japanese translator who learned Polish only in order to translate Bruno Schulz, but also scholars and translators from all over the world. And when I was there, I met, and David Grossman has been there, and so Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel a couple of years ago, told me that when she was in Drohobych, she was struck by a certain messianic fantasy, and that is, she went to the shul, the restored choral synagogue, and she began. We know the first couple of lines of this lost manuscript because Bruno Schulz told a friend, Arthur Sandauer, what they were. She took these lines and began to spin her own fantasy of how the Messiah might be completed, how that message that was undelivered in Schulz's lifetime might be delivered. The first lines of Bruno Schulz's Messiah are, "My mother woke me up one morning and said, the Messiah is here. He's in Sambor. Sambor is the next town over." This incursion of the messianic into the mundane, delivered through the voice of the mother before breakfast. And this is what Tokarczuk sort of began to spin out. Let me really close with a few words about mythology, since that's the way we started. And if we understand his views on mythology, we might begin to understand whether this Operation Schulz in 2001 was a clandestine rescue or a homecoming, an emancipation or a theft. I'll read to you from an essay that Bruno Schulz wrote on the closest that he came to a literary credo. And it's about his views on language and myth. Let me just pull it up here. Okay. So he described his second book, The Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, as, quote, a wreath of legends plaited from strands from all cultures and mythologies and transformed into a fascinating tangle of fabulation. That's his own self-understanding. In the late 1930s, as the Nazi menace was growing, Schulz published this essay called The Mythologization of Reality, and he says in this literary credo two things. First, I'm quoting, "Political programs are only the rationalized surface, an internal index of the deep transformations taking place in the depths of collective consciousness. They ferment in the mythical depths where the longings, raptures, ideals, and forms of the collective imagination are born." That's as far as his political views are concerned. Second, he says this notion of mythology affects not just my perception of politics, but more deeply my perception of language. He has a view that the everyday words that we use encode a grammar of myths. He says this, "We usually regard the word as shadow of reality. In other words, the thing comes first, and the word exists in its shadow." Schulz says the reverse of this statement would be more correct. Reality is the shadow of the word. Philosophy is actually philology, the deep creative exploration of the word. The old cosmogonies express this with the statement, "In the beginning was the word." But the isolated word is a mosaic piece, a late product. The primeval word was a shimmering aura circling around the sense of the world, and that was a great universal whole. The word in its common usage today is only a fragment a remnant of some all-embracing integral mythology. That's why it possesses a tendency to grow back, to regenerate. The life of the word, and with this I'll conclude, consists in tensing and stretching itself toward 1,000 connections, like the cut-up snake in the legend whose pieces search for each other in the dark. The thousand-formed but internal organism of the word was torn apart into syllables, sounds, and everyday speech. And in these new forms, adapted to practical needs, it was handed down to us as a mode of communication. The word itself, or words, long to connect with one another, to regain a sense of the original whole. And that longing, which disperses the dark, that longing to be complete again, Schulz calls a return to its verbal homeland, that we call poetry. So I think after Schulz's death, in this contest between various peoples, Ukrainians, Poles, and Israelis, over his legacy, something has been lost in our own perception of Schulz's myth-making. Something has become occluded. But if we read Schulz closely, I think maybe we'll find that there's a poetry there, not just in his own words, which seek to reconnect to one another, but in our longing to restore Bruno Schulz to his homeland, wherever that might be. So I thank you for that, and I look forward to discussing this in informal questions, with your informal questions. Thank you.
Taking the questions?
Sure, yeah.
Just note on the questions, you are being recorded, but the audience is not, so if you'd like to ask a question, you can state your name or affiliation. Thanks.
David.
David Mazawa from the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Thank you very much. First of all, that was fabulous and fascinating. So you mentioned his links with Dvorio Fogel and Rockel Auerbach, two writers who, as far as I know, chose Polish primarily, but could also, and did write in Yiddish and German and other things. So I'm curious whether there was ever a question of Schulz choosing Polish, and also how he's seen by within Poland and by Polish scholars. Is he squarely part of a Polish modernist tradition? Is there any ambivalence about him as a Polish writer? Curious about that.
The Poles were puzzled in 2001 because they saw Bruno Schulz, by dint of his language, if nothing else, as being firmly part of the Polish modernist tradition. He's still in the high school curriculum. He's often read as a part of a triad, literary Marx Brothers, you might say, with Gombrowicz and Witkiewicz. He has incredible correspondence with both. So the answer, in short, is from the Polish perspective, by dint of the language, he was considered to be very much a part of the Polish modernist tradition. Unlike them, he stayed in this relatively provincial Drohobycz, refused many offers to go to Warsaw, and as a matter of fact, all of his friends wanted to get him out of Drohobycz in 1942 and had supplied him with Aryan papers to do so via Warsaw. And November 19th, 1942 was the very date that they had set for his escape, and that was the day that he was killed. So to this day, I think that he's regarded in Poland as very firmly a Polish writer. Just as in parallel, Kafka, by dint of his language, would be considered a German writer, or German language writer, although he almost never lived in Germany. David.
David Wolpe. I'm at the Divinity School. I have two questions. One is not serious. The other one is serious. Now that you've done Kafka and Schulz, do you have any other Central European writers whose detritus ends up in Israel? Or are those the only two that you could find? And the more serious question is, the other writer that this part of Schulz reminds me of is a very different writer who's Isaac Babel, only in The Worship of Power. and the sense of almost masochistic vulnerability. And I wonder if that's a theme in modern writing, and if so, do you think it crosses, like obviously Babel was in Russia as opposed to Poland?
I think there's something there. Let me first, before getting to Babel, say something about the common conception that Schulz is a Polish Kafka. The question is, you say worship of power. The question is, who is the powerful, right? In Kafka, the power resides in the dominant father, and the son, the fictional son, is weak, in some cases transformed into a cockroach. In Schulz, the father is weak, the son is the vibrant, lively one, and Schulz also is keying into metamorphosis as a symbol of power. In his case, though, the father is the one who undergoes metamorphoses, sometimes into birds, in one memorable story into a cockroach, and in a third into a kind of crab whom the mother serves as the family dinner. So yes, worship of power, but who in whom does the power reside? And that I think accounts for the differences. Yeah, but I see this more as a Galician phenomenon or an Austro-Hungarian phenomenon than I don't know all that much about Babel's worship of power.
The Cossacks.
Yeah, yeah,
It wasn't a father or a son.
right.
I mean, a couple of his stories sort of valorize the Cossacks. So.
And fear of the Cossacks. I just read that Golda Meir's first memory was fear of the Cossacks banging down the door. She writes about this. Hmm?
In Milwaukee?
Back on the other side.
Back in the old country. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nancy Cott. I was curious about what artists influenced him or who he was in touch with, because the little bit of work, the one painting you showed us reminded me a little bit both of the Blau Reiter movement, but also of certain artists in New York who may have been immigrant artists and who painted the Lower East Side and the commercial scenes of the street. And they were urban, very much urban artists. So I was curious if where did he view art, or what artist did he admire, or was he in touch
We don't know a lot about that. He doesn't write about his artistic influences, and he was almost entirely self-taught. He never went to an art school. He also developed these etchings that I put up earlier, were a technique that only he at the time was using, the cliché-vert technique. They involved drawing lines on a photographic negative and then printing from the negative. Very complicated technique that he did in his home. So I don't know that much about how he himself, I think that we could speculate, but he himself didn't place himself in a debt to an artistic lineage, so to speak. And that's what makes it so interesting. But you'll know more about sort of, yeah, what possible antecedents he may have had.
Well, the question is just where and how would you have seen the art of others, right? I just don't know what Galicia.
I think the answer may lie in the years that he spent as a refugee in the First World War in Vienna, and he was going to museums in Vienna. We do know that. Yeah.
Use the negative as a plate, or you move from the negative to the plate?
He etched directly with a needle on,
The negative.
yes, through the negative, and then apparently inked the negative, and then pressed
Right. Well, it's very Goya-like.
Goya-like. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can you say a little more about how he acquired, what kind of Judaic knowledge he had and how he acquired it? He refers to the Book of Splendor, he refers to a Zohar. How does he pick up what he knows? What does he know?
There's a whole school in Polish scholarship that wants to see him as essentially as a Kabbalist. And let me just pull up a quote on that. He regularly published in Jewish Polish language papers, but I don't think was moored in liturgies, in Jewish rituals. I think the way I came to think of it is he made his own liturgy. And his liturgy is more daring and maybe more exalted than anything that he heard when he was going with his father once a year to the choral synagogue. His fiction, much like Kafka's, seldom makes explicit reference to Jews. He does on occasion compare the father to the biblical namesake of the character Jacob, and of course the Joseph, the dreamer. But like Kafka, I think he stripped most of his fiction of ethnic markers and also place markers. And it's exactly those blanks that tempted critics to kind of tease out biblical allusions in his work. One scholar said that his stories retain the essence of Jewish mythology, if not the realism of everyday Jewish life. So, in my opinion, and Rachel Auerbach, who was mentioned earlier, also read him this way. She said that Jewishness was the background and the very substance of his fantasy. So there's something there in a very oblique way, which raises the question that Kafka also raises in my mind, which is how does one write Jewishly in a Jewish language, or fashion a language such that it is a Jewish language, fashion an existing, fashion Polish or fashion German into a Jewish language without ever invoking Jewishness directly or explicitly. Yeah. And of course, the whole messianic theme explicitly draws from that.
Do you know if he had any knowledge of Hasidism? Because there's obviously a lot of parallels that one could draw between his fiction and someone like Rabbi Nachman.
Yeah, he knew.
He writes of his fascination with Hasidic life in Drohobych. There were there were 19 synagogues in Drohobych of all imaginable varieties, Hasidic, liberal, progressive. And he writes about his fascination with the Hasidic synagogue. He once took his students to draw to the Hasidic neighborhood in Drohobych, to draw them. And they questioned his fascination with the Hasidim. I don't think he had much knowledge of Hasidut per se, as far as the texts of Hasidut. But I wonder what he picked up just from being around, the Hasidic milieu.
This was the heartland of Hasidism.
Yeah.
Did he write about Sacher-Masoch at all? I mean, you mentioned him, but the pictures kind of, I don't know, seem to suggest, there's a lot of themes of humiliation and degradation, and they kind of suggest a possible link.
Fetishism, too.
What he did do is he was at first in the 1920s embarrassed by these images, and so he would tell his students and his colleagues at the high school that he was merely commissioned to illustrate Masoch's book Venus in Furs. And he passed off these etchings at first as illustrations of Venus in Furs, and only later did he claim, or did he acknowledge authorship, so to speak, of these. So that's the connection. So he was reading Sacher-Masoch, and that was very much. And there's also a wonderful novella called Inside the Head of Bruno Schulz by the Prague-born German writer Maxim Biller. It's all about this. In real life, Bruno Schulz corresponded with Thomas Mann. We have some of that correspondence. He shared stories with Thomas Mann, and Joseph and His Brothers was his favorite novel, Schulz's favorite novel. And Maxim Biller imagines the conversation with Mann as being centered on exactly these themes of the masochistic. I encourage. That's another, Maxim Biller is another one who belongs in this stream of writers who look to Schultz as a kind of guiding spirit. Siona.
Thank you so much. So many themes that I'm interested in, especially your discussions of power. And one question I have is whether in your book you elaborate on the sort of outgrowth story when it comes to Israel's claim on Schultz. And, you know, it's very striking the way you ended it with the word and the longing to become whole. And of course, Israel is forever ingathering the word and the image in art and literature. There's an ingathering of the diaspora, there's an invitation, and also a coercion also.
Some gatherings are more coerced than others.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Forced aliyah.
yeah, precisely. So I was wondering if in the book you you mention anything about, or you elaborate on this sort of this worldly messianic component to the ingathering in the political, cultural strategy of power and mastery over the word and image.
Yeah, so I'll answer that by saying that I posed exactly that question to the author of The Messiah of Stockholm, Cynthia Ozick, and who first of all said that Schultz was one of the most imaginative writers in the 20th century. And I asked her for her thoughts on what I called the justice of this ingathering of fragments. And the fact that they're fragmentary, that they're brought in fragmentary form, is also highly symbolic. And this is her answer in an email to me. She said, "My instinct, which is more primitive than any moonings over justice," I made a mistake in using that word apparently, insists that Europe has never deserved and never will deserve the presence of Jews or the work of their hands and their minds. Now, that's an extreme view on that end, but I want to contrast it with someone else that I spoke to in Drohobych, a Jewish woman, who used almost the same phrase of our hands. So there's an existing community of about 400 Jewish members of the community in Drohobych today. And one of them told me what Yad Vashem did in the name of Israel, in the name of ingathering, was so offensive to us, because if this is the way they treat the works of our hands, then how much more so would they treat living people like me? Those are the two extremes of reactions that I got when it comes to the question of ingathering. Either the Ozick position that Europe never deserved the work of our hands, so to speak, and then the other that the assumption that the work of our hands belongs elsewhere is deeply offensive.
How much is left in Poland of his work?
Of Schultz's work?
Of the mural.
So the Israelis, they took out 5 fragments from 3 walls. Schultz painted on 3 walls. And there are another 4 or 5 fragments that were left on the wall that now were taken off and are now on display in the Drohobych City Museum. Those are more minor scenes. There's a kind of wicked witch. There's a kind of sinister-looking black cat. And those are still there.
So did the Israelis only take what was visible at that time, or?
No, and this is another question. For example, which other country's secret service is making determinations about what is the best part of a mural to take? So no, by the time that they arrived, 3 months after the discovery, all the murals on all 3 walls were visible. How they made the choice of which scenes to take is something that will forever remain in mystery. Unless they speak, yes.
Don't do it to the Secret Service.
And is his self-portrait anywhere else in his artwork? Is the segment that they took the only iteration of his own self-portrait?
No, he did a series of self-portraits, one of which I used on the cover of my book. Most of them are in pencil or in pen at various stages in his life. Here he's already in his 40s. So no, he did do other self-portraits, and we don't have any painted self-portraits. I will mention that things are coming up all the time. If we think of Schulz's art as dense with disappearance, that disappearance is gradually receding, I think. So I'll give you one example. After this book came out, I got an email from someone in Los Angeles, your part of the world, and he says, I would like to offer my gratitude and a correction. We all get the readers we deserve. So the gratitude is, you mentioned my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, Maria so-and-so, because you have a scene in the book where Bruno Schulz walks into a room, sees a woman, and says, hold that pose, I need to draw you. The correction is that you numbered that work among the lost works of Bruno Schulz, and I must tell you that it's hanging on my wall in Beverly Hills, and here's a snapshot. And it's very, very beautiful. I'm not allowed to publish it, but it's very, very beautiful. Things are coming up in auction. In some cases, David and I were talking about Israeli auctions earlier. Things are surfacing from Bruno Schulz that had been considered lost. And I was also in touch with the Russian state archivist. Unfortunately, this was just after the war began, and she said, don't even bother to come to Moscow, because I learned that the Red Army had special units that was, in April 1945, they were taking wholesale archives from exactly this part of occupied Poland, including Gestapo archives, including private archives, and taking them back to the Red Army archives in Moscow. My own personal conviction is that the manuscript of the Messiah is among them. But I'll have to wait until more peaceful days to do that part of the detective work.
Did you sign his work?
His artworks?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Was Schultz's masochism, was it a phase early in his career, or did he maintain it, and do you connect it to a form of spiritualism, or, I mean, there's lots of ways you can interpret those paintings. One would be some kind of a connection of the erotic and the ascetic, which of course has a long spiritual tradition, or it could be read in an entirely secular way.
Well, let me answer that with, to tie it into actually the last question, if I may. One of the rediscoveries recently of Bruno Schulz's works was the first short story he ever published. It was only discovered 2 or 3 years ago, and I met the discoverer, Lesya Chomich, in Drohobych. And the story is this. In many of his works, not only does he sign the works, but he titles many of them. And one of the recurring figures, and I think this is one of them, the woman on the right, is named Undula. We don't know where that name comes from, but that's the name of this. That's the name that he gives to this. So we have this Undula figure, and there's this Ukrainian researcher who's looking at something else entirely. She's looking at that part of Galicia was like the Polish Klondike, and Bruno Schulz's older brother was a petroleum executive who helped support his artistic endeavors, and so she's doing research on the Polish petroleum newspapers. They had their own newspapers, industry newspapers, but in those days, industry newspapers had literary sections, and they published a short story, and the title struck her immediately. She's not a Schulz scholar, but the title was Undula. Turns out that this is the first published piece that we know of by Bruno Schulz, and he did it under a pseudonym, I think because he didn't want to embarrass his respectable older brother. And it's in a sense the missing link between the eroticism and masochism of the visual art and the fictional art, because it's his most erotically charged short story. That's another reason he probably did publish it under another name. Well, maybe you can say more about what a religious reading of
Submission to authority, and the ascetic tradition in many religions of willingly enduring pain as a form of self-abnegation, whether it's the hair shirt or self-flagellation or isn't it? Sitting on an anthill, isn't that what the Hasidei Ashkenaz did? So I mean, there's this long tradition. It doesn't have the explicit sexual component, but hurting oneself. In this case, I mean, I don't know, because masochism can mean not just being humiliated, it can actually mean being physically hurt.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a dimension of his writing, where he's actually being physically hurt by women, or if it's just these symbols of degradation, humiliation, being literally at their feet.
In the writing, it doesn't involve punishment, whips, or anything of that nature. In the writing, it involves self-abnegation to an object of desire that doesn't acknowledge me. That is to say, like in the painting, or in like some of these, the woman doesn't even deign to look at the groveling man or the passerby, or if she does look, she sort of casts a glance over her shoulder. So to me, I read that as an unfulfilled yearning for recognition. Recognition by whom? I'm not sure. But the humiliation of seeking recognition where it cannot be found. The paradox is that actually he gained recognition for his writing. He won the highest literary award in Poland at the time. The only disappointing thing about that is that it did not come, unlike the Sammy Rohr Prize, did not come with a monetary reward. On the contrary, Bruno Schulz writes that he had to pay for the medal himself out of his own pocket. So he was lauded in a certain sense. He was very well known. He was published by the best publishers. It wasn't that he didn't have recognition. So I leave it as an open question what kind of recognition he was searching for as expressed here. Because what I didn't mention, and I should have, is that many of the faces, speaking of Siona's question of self-portraits, are also here in these very similar, in other words, he's not just doing the standard frontal self-portraits, but he's also depicting himself in some of these masochistic scenes.
I hate to ask this typical of a question, but do we know anything about his mother?
What's very interesting in the stories is that the mother is largely on the margins of the narrated stories. That's why I concentrated on the three figures that I did. She is not all that present. We do know that that he associated the mother in real life with the German language. Bruno Schulz had perfect German. This is why he could correspond with Thomas Mann. He wrote a short story in German. He chose Polish, but he got German from his mother, and he writes very affectionately about the mother reading stories and myths of Goethe to him as a young child. So I think that's the association. I think only very marginally. That wasn't a real choice for him. So when he corresponded with Yiddish writers like Dvorah Fogel, he was corresponding in Polish with them. And that also speaks to the deep divide in Polish letters between those like Singer, who are on the Yiddish side of the ledger, and those like Schulz, who are on the Polish, and who had no knowledge of one another.
More of comments, when I look at it, it's interesting about his being rooted in his Polish environment, because the organization of the picture borrows a great deal from adoration pictures.
Adoration pictures,
You
yes.
see all the people focusing not on the beautiful lady, but on this little guy bending over there, which is a very interesting thing, how it's obviously taken from the Christian culture around him.
That's
one
right.
comment. The other regarding where would the archives go, there was the big argument about the German Jewish archives. Where do they go? And they split them by some. Europe was not particularly good, if they claim him, in maintaining the Jewish whatever history, and they were extremely good at destroying it, including whatever is missing of Bruno Schulz. So the 400, my heart goes to them, but the other 3 million.
Which I think raises another question of how states appropriate art and use art and artists for purposes of cultural legitimacy and self-legitimation, and how, I'll give you two examples of this. In both the cases of Schulz and Kafka, it's very convenient in a certain way for, let's say, the Ukrainians or the Poles to claim him posthumously, and it is as convenient for the Germans now to claim Kafka precisely as a Jew. Let me elaborate for a moment. I went to the German Literary Archive in Marbach. It's near Stuttgart, and I asked the director the following question. I said, you've spent a lot of money on an 8-year legal process to try to get the manuscripts of Franz Kafka from where they were in Tel Aviv to your archive in Germany. I said, in the end of the day, both you and the National Library in Jerusalem have pledged to digitize this archive. Why does it matter geographically where they are? And his response staggered me. His name is Ulrich Rauf. He said, well, I think it does matter. Because if the Israelis get this archive of Franz Kafka, then Kafka will be read narrowly as a Jewish writer. If, however, Kafka ends up here, alongside all the greats in the pantheon of German writing, then Kafka will be read universally. And I was staggered because I realized that this man thought of Germany as now representing or standing for universal European humanist culture as such, and the Israelis were the narrow. And what?
They have another millennium to return.
at least a millennium. And the Israelis are perceived as grasping with narrow interests, right? Well, the same thing in the case of Bruno Schulz. Many people I spoke to looked, in present-day Western Ukraine, looked to Schulz as a symbol of a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic past that contrasts with the monolithic present. In other words, it's a political use of memory in both of these cases. So thank you for that, for raising that point.
Has the short story been translated into English?
Undula? Yes, I should say that Schulz's stories have been translated in their entirety 3 times. The first in the 1960s, that was the version Philip Roth popularized. The second was about 10 years ago by a scholar named Madeleine Levine, excellent translation. And the third just came out in April, by chance exactly the same time as my book, by a Cambridge scholar named Stanley Bill. And the last that I mentioned, the Stanley Bill translation, includes the first English translation of Undula, which I can highly recommend. Yes.
I suppose you mentioned that somebody wanted to translate Schulz into Japanese and he didn't know Polish. So what made him aware of Schulz
To begin with.
so much as he went to learn a language that he doesn't know to translate it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Schulz has now been translated into more than 40 languages, including, of course, Hebrew. One of the last languages was Ukrainian. That was a recent translation. But this translator, the Japanese translator, her name is Ariko Kato, and I think she also reads in English. So I think she had access to Schulz first in English and became, like so many Schulzologists, obsessed. There's a certain cult of Bruno Schulz. He's often understood, I think, wrongly as a writer's writer, but I think she had access through the English translations to the world of Schulz, and that was sufficient to engage her to learn Polish.
There's something similar with Amos Oz's Chinese translator, who learned Hebrew largely so that whatever, I forget the name of the institute in Shanghai where they translate world literature. I was there and they met, like, here's the Philip Roth person, and here's the Amos Oz person. It's very organized. and she did Amos Oz, and she learned Hebrew in order to translate Amos Oz, and her Hebrew was good, but not really good enough. So she actually used a combination of the Hebrew and the English translations. And so I don't read Chinese, so I don't know how they came out, but you might want to read them in Hebrew or in English instead.
Why do you say wrongly known as a writer's writer?
Well, what does it mean to say a writer's writer? I mean, so for example, in our generation, Nicole Krauss has been obsessed with Bruno Schulz. She has used him as a fictional character. Jonathan Safran Foer wrote a book called The Tree of Codes, in which he took the text of Bruno Schulz in English and found a specialty publisher in England that used a laser technique to take out certain chunks of text, sometimes a word, sometimes a phrase, and by erasure, created new stories. This must have taken some time. When I say, so to say a writer's writer means inaccessible somehow, or esoteric, and I think that, especially with these new translations, Schulz is the very opposite. The sensuality of his language is opposite, for example, the pared down German of Franz Kafka, and his serpentine sentences and the slant of his syntax just, to me at least, draw you in. You don't have to be a specialist, or what does it mean to be a writer's writer? Saul Bellow once said he can't read for pleasure anymore because he reads other novelists the way a surgeon looks at other surgeons' stitches. That's the writer's writer. It means I look at the stitching. Well, I think that Bruno Schulz is far more important than an example of linguistic or syntactical stitching. That's what I mean by wrongly conceived as a writer's writer. Any other comments? Yes.
I just have a simple question. Do you know Polish?
Do I know Polish?
Did you read Bruno Schulz?
I did not read in the original Polish, no.
Maybe you can learn.
Yes, that's a great aspiration of mine.
I am Polish of origin, and of course I read Bruno Schulz in Polish. The language is so incredibly beautiful, and it was written in the 30s or before that. It's really worth learning the language.
Thank you.
Okay, well, you have a project now. Well, thank you for...
Thank you all.
Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate your attendance.
There was a